Hello! In this episode, I'm looking at the mysterious creature at the heart of Final Fantasy VII's science fantasy villainy, Jenova. Now, I've discussed Final Fantasy VII a fair amount over the years, but as with many fans of the game, I've often skipped over any real attention to Jenova, looking instead at Sephiroth or Shinra as sources of villainy in the game, and indeed other aspects of the game's story and characters entirely. But Jenova is a fascinating concept, and like previous discussions on Shinra, on Sephiroth, and on Hojo, I think Jenova is a huge factor, and in fact probably the main factor at the root of what elevates Final Fantasy VII out of the high fantasy and into the science fiction genre, which I'll consider over the course of this episode. And along with the aforementioned Shinra, Hojo and Sephiroth, Jenova also forms part of this interrelated quartet of characters that through both intent and happenstance enable one another and contribute to the world-threatening events at the heart of Final Fantasy VII. Now, first off, just to focus on the sci-fi and cyberpunk aspects of Jenova, it's interesting to note how it follows in the footsteps of Hollywood B-movies through the 20th century. Since the whole alien arriving on a meteor thing has played out several times in movies like Evolution, Slither, The Blob, and so on, and more broadly we see extraterrestrials coming into contact with humans by piggybacking on man-made or inanimate objects in space, with aliens being a classic example. And while Final Fantasies have always indulged a bit of alien and extraterrestrial references in their games, dating all the way back to the very first one in 1987, Final Fantasy VII, with its malevolent, parasitic space alien at the centre of our villain's schemes, was probably the closest nod to the sci-fi genre that we'd seen in the game, and certainly the closest with regards to its central story. And indeed, where these aforementioned B-movie villains, like the Blob, generally arrived on Earth to parasitically propagate itself and feed off the indigenous species, so too does Jenova surf the cosmos for precisely this reason. And actually, despite its applied pronouns and its humanoid appearances in the games, one of the things I've always liked about Jenova is how these traits and designations are things that have been applied to it and things that it has adopted since arriving on Gaia, and really, as we discover in NPC and optional dialogues, particularly those found at Dr. Gast's house in the Icicle Inn, Jenova is in fact an enigmatic, shape-shifting parasite that adopts appearances familiar to its prey as a way of deceiving and later destroying them, as was the case when it wiped out the Ancients, which is what Dr. Gast refers to in the dialogue. But with this knowledge, we can also perhaps reappraise Sephiroth's relationship with Jenova, and I touched on this briefly in the past in my Sephiroth discussions as well, because while he maniacally refers to it constantly as Mother, and he pulls back the notably feminine metal effigy at Nibelheim to reveal a silver-haired, vaguely humanoid woman, not dissimilar from Sephiroth himself, we could suppose that in its inherent shape-shifting deceptiveness, maybe Jenova is appearing to Sephiroth as this silver-haired female to enforce that maternal feeling within him, because of course he is the strongest Jenova clone and the most likely candidate to ensure its reunion and its survival, which is something I find quite interesting. But it would also account for the fact that while Jenova is generally portrayed as a humanoid female, every instance in which we fight it, it manifests as a classically parasitic-looking blob of weird appendages and stuff like that, up to and including the newest Jenova boss fight in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. And so, just to conclude on Jenova's visual design, it definitely reinforces this sci-fi, and I think distinctly Japanese dystopian sort of cyberpunk sci-fi vibe, particularly when we look at the classic Jenova, the one that Sephiroth reveals when he pulls away the metal statue, because despite looking mostly human, Jenova still has these weird orifices and organic tubes hanging out of it. It has an eyeball on its mammary, and it's suffixed by a giant, improbably sized heart under its feet. And it looks as if you've asked an AI generator to design a human and its organs. But actually, if we turn to some pop cultural Japanese references in the cyberpunk and sci-fi genres, such as the movie Akira, which sees the antagonist Tetsuo manifest into this horrifying organic mass in the ending, or Ghost in the Shell, with Motoko's cybernetic body, we can see precisely how Jenova's bizarre appearance is very much in keeping with this subgenre of the time, and I think a classic example of Japanese cyberpunk. So, moving on, while Jenova is a significant antagonistic force and a recurring boss battle through Final Fantasy VII, I think it's also fair to say it's a more passive sort of villainy compared to the others that I've mentioned. And it's largely down to Hojo and his predecessors' experiments with Jenova, resulting in Sephiroth, resulting in Genesis and Crisis Core, and so on, that Jenova really plays a part in the Final Fantasy VII story. However, that said, one theory that's always interested me, which plays into this inherent parasitic nature of the alien, and what Hojo refers to as the Jenova reunion theory, wherein those hosting cells return to reform the creature, is this question of control around that, and specifically the struggle for control between Sephiroth and Jenova itself. Because while it's supposed that Sephiroth's will overrides the strength of Jenova, which is of course why predominantly we see Sephiroth appearing through the game, which is actually, simply Jenova cells, because the real Sephiroth is in the northern crater. We don't see him until, quite late into the game. But despite this, it does beg the question of why he is pursuing the Jenova reunion, which is the alien's ultimate goal, of course. And it also raises the question of Jenova appearing to Sephiroth as a silver-haired female, the aforementioned infatuation with Jenova as a maternal figure, and this sort of thing, because of course technically it's Lucretia that is Sephiroth's mother, although I don't think there's evidence in-game to suggest that he actually knows that. But regardless, it does add this interesting dimension to things that I only raise because I saw it pointed out in a forum a while back, and this alternative theory that's been suggested, that Jenova is actually in control despite Sephiroth's illusion of control, because it's kind of baked into the cells, it's baked into Sephiroth's genetic material to sort of reform to the master being. But again, that is not the accepted canon for the game. I'm not proposing that it is. And the only way I see it potentially having any legitimacy is if, and I was talking about this in my recent Sephiroth discussion actually, but if they attempt to make Sephiroth a more tragic or redemptive figure in future games, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, this could be one of the routes they could take, because it would amplify his tragedy, technically, and it would also reduce his accountability for the awful stuff that he's done, because if it's technically Jenova in control, even on a kind of basic genetic level, then it does sort of redeem Sephiroth somewhat in the eyes of players. But of course that remains to be seen, and I do find it unlikely. And actually, with all of this time-shifting parallel universe stuff, like with Zack Fair reviving and so on, I think it's interesting to see how and where Jenova actually slots in to this new chronology, because the game seems to be much more focused on Sephiroth and Cloud over anything else at the moment, and whether Jenova will receive any renewed prominence, as a part of that, I think it remains to be seen. So there we have it, a very brief look at Jenova, often overlooked, but really fantastic contribution as this avatar of Final Fantasy VII's shift into the realms of cyberpunk and sci-fi genre. And I think it's an excellent cornerstone of what makes this game so unique and memorable within the anthology of Final Fantasy games. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked the episode, please consider subscribing and drop a comment to let me know your thoughts on the character